Welcome to Rajya Sabha TV. Today, we are going to have a very special discussion as a part of Indian History Congress. The topic of today's discussion is why there was no Renaissance in India and also scientific Renaissance in India. Historians generally say that Renaissance took place somewhere around 16th and 17th century in Europe. The scientific revolution followed. And some people think that modern science is uniquely a Western creation. And people even use words like, for example, Western science. Then the question comes, if indeed modern science is Western science, that is, it has some unique characteristics of Western European culture, then the question comes that why did it originate only in Europe and not in anywhere else? What are the special characteristics that made modern science to emerge in Western Europe? Then the corollary question is that why such a revolution did not take place elsewhere, India or China? Why the scientific revolution took place in Pisa and not in Peking or Patna is a kind of question that some people raise and debate within the history of science. These are the kinds of issues that we are going to debate in today's program. And we are having a panel of experts here with us. And I would like to introduce Prabir Purkayastha from Delhi Science Forum. Thank you for joining us in this show. And we are with us Dr. Dhruv Raina from Professor Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And then we have with us Dinesh Abral, who is from Institute for Studies in Industrial Development in Delhi. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Dr. N. Raghuram, who is a professor and dean of School of Biotechnology, Guru Gobind Singh, Indraprastha University, Delhi. Thank you for joining in the show. And let me start with this question to Dr. Dhruv Raina, who is an accomplished historian of science. This question, which is usually called as the Nedamian question, why scientific revolution did not take place in countries like India, China, although if you look at the development of S&T in these places were much advanced at one point of time. Why it did not take place in this area and took place in Western Europe? How is it being looked at in the history of science? What will be your reaction to it?
Yeah, I mean, the debate over the last 3 decades has been quite intense and complicated about the nature of this question itself. The question presumes the validity of a kind of comparative history, and it is underpinned by a particular model of explanation that certain events took place in Europe. The question of the rise of modern science is also connected up with the rise of capitalism in the West. And so you have another question, which is a Weber question: what are the factors that led to the rise of capitalism? And the flip side of the question is, what led to the rise of modern science? And so both historians and philosophers of science have questioned the meta-theory of underlying this question, that we seem to assume that all cultures, all civilizations pass through very similar stages of historical development. And a number of historians have since argued that this really need not be the case. Having said that, I mean, the second aspect is that, well, did the scientific renaissance take place in India? Did it not? Were the Middle Ages, Dark Ages? These are questions, again, which since the 1990s, historians historical research has provided us very different answers from what my generation of students and scholars grew up with.
That's an interesting point. I would now like to ask the response from Prabir Purkayastha. How would you react to this particular question? I mean, it's been a question which perhaps have been asked in this country for almost last about 3 decades.
I think the question is more a response to the history of capitalism and colonialism rather than a history of question of, history of science. Because what you now trace back to European Renaissance is really because imperialism, colonialism grew in Europe, and therefore this question comes up. Otherwise, all societies have breaks, some before, some after. The Chinese were well advanced for thousands of years. So was Indian civilization well advanced for a number of years. And these are then not a question. Why did the Mongols conquer Europe is not a question, but the question is always asked in this form. So I think it's a framing of the question I would ask. Why don't we ask the question, for instance, why did modern slavery start in Europe by really destroying Africa? Why are such questions not asked? Because they're really of much greater importance to society as we know today. So I think how you frame the question matters. But I think there are two elements to this reality we also must address. One is the fact that between 16th to 18th century, what happens is science and technology comes together. Now that is a development that takes place over 200, 250 years. In India, unfortunately, we could have done that much earlier. We didn't have the dark ages that Europe had, but the caste system prevents technology and knowledge, scientific knowledge, from coming together because they belong to different castes. So I think, and that's an impediment even today. It's not an impediment only in the past, it's an impediment even today. That's why I do well in computer science, but not in others.
That's an interesting point. From that, we'll take on, what's some people would call as Devi Prasad Chattopadhyaya thesis that the progress of science and technology in India had a great impediment in the form of caste system, which essentially made the brain and hand separated. I would like to ask Professor N. Raghuram, what's your reaction to this thesis? How do you look at this particular idea which many people talk about?
See, the European Renaissance, the way it was understood, and it had a context. It didn't happen in vacuum. There was a lot of investment available from the growing loot of the colonies. All that money came into Europe and it was ready to be gambled, and that money was put into a lot of new ideas, innovations, and that became initially one of the major reasons for the growth. We didn't have that kind of risk capital available from looting of colonies. We were ourselves victims of colonialization. So the context for us were very different from the context that existed at the time when the European Renaissance happened. And in any case, European Renaissance itself is a very contested issue, and whether it actually contributed to the scientific renaissance or whether there were clear discontinuities and clear departure from a revivalism of the ancient knowledge towards creationism and innovation. They are two very different things. And today, in today's context, when we talk of a Renaissance, we have to also clearly distinguish ourselves from whether we are looking at it from the point of view of revivalism of ancient knowledge, and especially considering all the feudal hang-ups that still exist in the Indian society, or whether we break free from feudalism and break away from mere celebration of the ancient knowledge and start working towards creation of new knowledge and innovation from there for more useful growth in the science as well as in the society.
That's a point I think we need to explore further, but before we proceed, I would like to ask Dinesh Abrawal, one of our distinguished panelists. Some economic historians say roughly about 1/4 of world's GDP during the Mughal period was the Mughal kingdom. But today, if you look at countries like India, largely we are classified as a developing country. The Western Europe and US are economically, scientifically and technologically most advanced. This essentially shows that there has been something that happened which actually stifled the growth in India or countries like India. What's your take on that issue?
I think we need to go back to what the historians have always talked about, that 1,000 years ago, roughly, progress did get, if not a full stop, a semicolon. And I think the surplus which was being created also by the ruling classes in the society, where was it being invested? Was it being really invested in industry, invested in practical instrumental challenges, out of which the science and technology really came together? in Europe and so on and so forth? Or was it being invested in building temples and establishing the authority of the ruling classes using religious instruments? So I think that might have come in the way of the development of even capitalist break that Europe saw in our country. That's also the kind of explanation the historians have explored. In our case, I think is a relevant argument as well. We did see a break where, you know, the ruling classes did decide during the post-independence period to actually make a break with the past as well. And a lot of investment took place in our own institutions as far as is concerned. And we saw a lot of diversity also. And we did see the emergence of the, I call it a break, a renaissance, a predecessor or precedent being created in a variety of ways. What we see today in our own institutions of space, whether we see in the institutions of CSIR contributing to the pharma, and all that to me see are, you know, revitalization possibilities, potential which always existed in our own society as far as is concerned. Similarly, there's a rise of China now as far as is concerned. They've been able to mobilize political resources, intellectual resources, actually to, you know, using even their old knowledge as far as is concerned, Chinese medicine and so on, etc. I think the question is, if that particular break is not being sustained, why is that happening as far as is concerned? I think the answers lie in both social structure, that is, to which we referred in the hand and head divide, as well as the way the institutions have been built subsequently, the closer took place to the diversity as far is concerned. I think lie in the way the leadership got established in these institutions, whether there was a tolerance enough for the open-ended, ill-structured questions which needed to be tackled in our own, or whether we were imitative alone as far as is concerned. If we are imitative, then obviously innovation does not take place.
Yeah, one of the points that you made is that perhaps during the Mughal period or after the Mughal period that the monies were being used mostly for building temples or, you know, establishing the political authority, which essentially means that, you know, most of the rulers were kind of despotic, and then there was not enough condition for the emergence of capitalism. Is that the only one that you would also say?
You know, that's true for Europe as well. Mosques, churches, temples is how medieval societies built, quote unquote, their temporal and physical authority. So that's not a new one. The real issue is that there is a mistake in understanding history, that we think that capitalism emerged first through industrial revolution and then imperialism, colonialism, all of it happened. So really history is somewhat different. It's really colonial plunder which starts first, and slavery, selling human beings to Latin America, the Americas, selling them as actual commodities. And that's where capital comes from, plunder and slavery. And that's something we seem to lose sight of. So industrial revolution is not Renaissance. Let's be very clear. Yeah. It comes out of capital, which comes out of these two things. The question is, we still have an independent question that yes, science and technology does develop in Europe. The period is much longer, 16th to 18th century. And that is something that we didn't see here. That's true. We had great advances right from the beginning. We didn't go through dark ages. We had 50% of world GDP, India and China put together, and that's dwindled considerably. So something did happen. And how did it happen is an important historical question, quiet question. Why didn't it happen here? The argument could be our ruling classes were more stable. You see, the what's called just the gunpowder and a gun destroyed European feudalism. It had no impact in China. So those could be questions that we need to answer. But we shouldn't forget, yes, there were internal reasons why we have impediments, and Dinesh has talked about something even post-independence, where we are imitative. So our colonial mindset still stays. We don't still want to work with our hands. We do not want to innovate. We have the Brahmanical system of learning by rote, which has been reinforced really in today's times. And therefore, a Renaissance, if it means new thinking, creating new things, is something that has to come from a social upheaval, which we still have to really be a part of. If we don't have that social upheaval, if we don't banish the modes of thought which recreates the caste system in India, which recreates a certain kind of ideology, then we are going to see a problem of innovation and new thinking. And that's our challenge.
Yeah, coming back to the point that some panelists have been making till now, like the question of industrial revolution. The industrial revolution was essentially fueled by the colonial plunder and the monies that were and slavery that were taken from different colonies, in particularly Africa and Latin America, is a point that have been made by three panelists.
And India and China.
And India, China together
When it comes
also.
to plunder, India and China do play a major
Yeah,
role.
but slavery essentially from Africa, I think. Yeah, that's a interesting note which gives us a different version, a different way of looking at this issue. But coming back to my earlier question, how much of the Indian social structure itself was a major impediment to developments in India? How much we would say is because of that, and or is it largely only because of the colonial plunder that underdevelopment state, what we see today, India and other third world countries, it's essentially because of the colonial structures, or was there also a very strong internal reasons for it? Dhruv, would you like to?
No, I don't know. I mean, I agree with Prabir that and that the question of the industrial revolution is more important. We overemphasize the scientific revolution, and historians like Eric Hobsbawm and others have repeatedly tried to remind us that the scientific revolution was something which just took place in one small field of physics in the 17th century, which we've expanded with a capital S and a capital R and called it the scientific revolution. What happened in physics and chemistry and biology, chemistry and biology happened much later, more than 150 years later. It is the industrial revolution which was important, and then we tend to turn to, okay, so what would be the social structures that occasioned it? And I think that the industrial revolution, in addition to the rise of colonialism, was also in a way built out of a new configuration between the world of knowledge and the world of industry. All right. And so when I turn back to the Indian question of the scientific revolution, what I would like to explore is, I turn to a Europe in the 16th century and I see 100 universities in Europe. Just look at the number of expert people you are preparing. That order of magnitude is anything you would not see in India, in South Asia at least, in the 16th and 17th century. You read historians like Sheldon Pollock and others, and they'll say, well, there were three important axes of knowledge production, Delhi, Banaras, on the west coast, and then in the south. But you didn't just have so many universities. So I think that the question is, how did you look at knowledge, and did you see knowledge as something which was to be distributed, shared amongst larger groups of people? I think that ideal of knowledge was something which we sadly lacked within the social structure. So, Janardhan Guneri writes a book called The Lost Age of Reason. Why is this? So this is more or less concurrent with the European Revolution, scientific revolution in Europe in the 17th century. Why is it the lost age of reason? Why doesn't this lost age of reason propagate throughout the subcontinent? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. So I'd like to shift then. Yeah, so there is a question of social structure, but I think social institutions and theories of knowledge are correlated. Corresponding to particular kinds of social institutions, there are particular theories of knowledge. And over there, we should look for an explanation.
Social structure and the social structure of knowledge institutions are all related.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Dinesh, I think.
While I think it was brought out that what happened in Europe was also similar to what happened during the medieval period out here as well. But I think the point just now which Dhruv made with regard to the way the educational institutions, universities, schools were out here missing, I think that's where the surplus could have been invested by the state as far as is concerned. And even to the extent that the institutions were built, were they built for whom? Were they built for really science and technology being brought together, being brought together? No. In fact, the kind of break that we saw in the universities out there as far as is concerned, we do not see it in our own case in the educational institution. And I think that's the challenge which, like Prabir talked about, rote learning as far as is concerned. We have both the social structure impinging on education institutions at the moment, the way the caste discrimination enters in our own school, including through the theory of knowledge as far as is concerned. As well as, the colonial structures which are still, whose hangover exists within our institutions, the way the university are being run, etc. And more so now, the kind of break that we saw, that we thought that the universities can become a different kind of a place, our own S&T institutions being today we see a lot of decline and decay in that. And I think that's an important question, that how institution building is being tackled. Let me just refer to the question of language. Science education needs to be taught in the multilingual processes. That's not happening as far as it's concerned. That deprives a large number of people who are bright, brilliant, who can contribute, not able to contribute as far as it's concerned.
That's a point. When one gives a story that modern science is essentially Western science, and it emerged in Western Europe because of some specific conditions, be it capitalism or be it Calvinic ethos or whatever it is, if you give that kind of a story, then two corollaries automatically follow. One is that if it is Western science, then what we should be looking in India is something like a Swadeshi science or a Indian science or a Hindu science. That's one kind of a corollary that can come. The second corollary is that if you say that the science emerged in Europe because of some specific condition, then how do we make those specific conditions in India? These are the two kinds of exploration people will take if you put that question in that framework. So when you are putting a question, essentially you are putting a question of the past, you are actually also reflecting on what we need to do today. So that's a kind of discussion I would like to move in this debate, and I would like Professor Raghuram, what are the issues you think are contemporary challenges? How do you, what kind of issues you would like to put as a contemporary issues? Do we need to go back to our ancient sciences and revive them, or what do we do now?
Well, as Dinesh has pointed out, right from the early decades of independence, there was a recognition that huge investments in science, technology and education were essential for nation building as a task. But the momentum that it should have picked up did not remain through the decades. In the first 50 years of independence, we have had 250 universities and 40 CSIR labs, another 40 ICIR labs. But in the last 10 years, we have had 750 universities that have come up. Does it mean that in the last 10 years of 500 private universities added to the 250 public universities added in the past half a century, there is a huge change in the social investments in education? No, it's not just sometimes the numbers are important, the scaling of push given for education and innovation is important, but it's also important to look at how you run these institutions, what kind of break from the past you allow, did you break the existing social hierarchies? In Europe, it was the artisans and the common people who went into craftsmen, who went on to become innovators and technologists and many even scientists. The man who invented the microscope was not a great scientist of any training, because I am a biologist, I know it very well. But we don't have our artisans, our craftsmen getting the same opportunity for higher education and innovation, which is all entirely captured in our own existing social hierarchy in the caste system. Plus the feudal manner in which our institutions continue to be run even today is a big impediment in the growth of independent ideas, the growth of creativity and the ability to create new things. We are constantly torn between trying to maintain a certain strict rigid social order or a feudal order even in running the modern scientific institutions and educational institutions, and our need for creating something new. So they are working at cross purposes sometimes.
Yeah, that's a moving on. Prabir, I mean, we don't have much time, about 4 minutes now. I mean, in some sense also a kind of your last view on this show. There have been a lot of people who have been arguing that we should be recovering our sciences rather than discovering knowledge. How do you look at that issue? And that's how, I mean, India can leapfrog into future.
You know, this obscurantism view of science is not even worth engaging with, because looking at the past and navel gazing are almost similar activities. I don't give it any importance whatsoever in the enterprise of science. 2 plus 2 will be 4. If you drop something from a tower, it will fall. These are universal. There is no Western Indian science to this. So I think that should be put to bed completely. Second point of it is that if science is universal, it also needs to be democratized. And I think that's the key challenge we face today. If we don't democratize knowledge, if we don't involve everybody, what we have talked about, growth of knowledge is going to be harmed. Just imagine how many Einsteins do not even have basic education in this country, are not able to study physics because we have 1.2 billion people. What are you doing with them? So those are the kind of issues we need to face. And lastly, I will say the instruments of inquiry is what also makes science. And instruments of inquiry are made by craftsmen, made by technology. And if we focus only on quote unquote scientific knowledge as a Brahmanical knowledge system, we are not going to develop. And that's also the kind of bias that is there in our existing educational system that we see.
That's an interesting point. Coming on to Dhruv, I mean, you are an accomplished historian of science. About 30, 40 years ago, the Nedamian question was one of the major questions that historians of science in third world like India, others were kind of focusing. If you are looking at today, what kind of questions you think is important in the history of science to look at so that we get a better understanding and also a better perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the major questions, and that itself is a product of a certain kind of globalization which we may have questions about, but I mean, I think historians over the past 10 to 15 years have been looking at processes of the circulation of knowledge, have been trying to work out frameworks for writing global histories of knowledge, and have been, what they've all come around is that the nation or the civilization cannot be the unit to discuss the history of the circulation of knowledge, which is why you will see in a lot of discussion everybody is working on transnational histories, transcultural histories. So one. Number two, I mean, precisely because what I said before of the connection between institutions and theories of knowledge, I mean, historians of science themselves have begun to reprofile themselves as historians of knowledge. All right, because basically the moment you say science, you're talking about an institutional structure that goes back 200 years.
Okay. That's a point. Coming back to Dinesh, we are a very underdeveloped world. What do you think is the major challenge if we have to modernize? Modernize in the sense of, having human development.
See, we are entering into a new kind of revolution which is required to be undertaken, not only within our nation but all over the world. The kind of threats which we have seen to the planetary cycles, climate change, biodiversity, water, and so on, etc. So the way the industrial revolution needs to take place is in a very different way. The way agricultural revolution needs to take place is in keeping ecological dimensions in mind. Agroecological approaches which are still not finding way in our Indian Council of Agriculture research systems or in our agriculture universities or so on, etc., have the capacity to actually bring back the local economy and the industry artisans into the networks of production as far as is concerned, and sciences can contribute. Similar challenges exist across today's different sectors. One can talk of whether it's in medicine or in the way you want to deal with environmental challenges and so on, etc. I think that transformation, for that, whether the science is prepared, whether our institutions are prepared, the way the industry is being run, and we are, I think, really adopting or becoming subservient to the imperialist designs which the transnational capital has. I think we need to keep that in mind. Are we really building autonomy? I think the delinking needs to be done even when we look at the global history of whether science or industry as far as is concerned.
That's an interesting note to come to an end to this panel discussion. We had a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you all the panelists for being with us in the show. We don't have much time. We could have discussed quite a lot. We could have explored some of these issues even in much detail. Perhaps in another show we'll meet and then we'll explore some of these ideas in detail. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the show.